Chapter 4. She was a slender woman in her 30s, wearing jeans, a leather jacket, and a yellow button-down shirt. She looked like she meant business, though she didn't seem terribly eager to shoot him. "What are you doing here?" she demanded of him. "I didn't kill him," he answered. "As soon as he did, it sounded lame." "I know that," she snapped. "Unless you figured out how to hide a pistol in that skin-tight suit of yours, it'd stick out like a tumor." "Thanks," he offered. "Don't be funny. Tell me what you know. Any chance you could put that gun down?" The woman glared at him, then sighed. "I don't suppose it would do much good against you anyhow." She holstered her weapon. "You just grab it with that rope thingies of yours." "They're actually webs," Spider-Man said. "Powered by science. Anyhow, let's do this the polite way. I'm Spider-Man, and you are?" "Lieutenant Yuri Watanabe," she said in a clipped voice. "And I'm not looking for a new pal. You are a person of interest in a murder investigation, and while bringing you to the precinct for question would present some challenges, putting out an EPB on you would probably mess up your week. So how about you stop wasting my time?" No nonsense, tough as nails, and willing to work with Spider-Man. He liked that, and it made him think. 4 years. You wonder how much more he can get done if he had a direct relationship with the police department. His mind raced with the possibilities. The trick would be to prove his worth to her. That would involve a much lower percentage of wisecracks percentage than what came naturally, but he was pretty sure if he stayed focused, he could get it done. "Tell me how I could help," he said. "Why did your voice suddenly get so deep?" "It didn't." "It did, and it still is. Before you sounded like a kid." "Hey!" "And now you sound like a kid trying to fool someone over the phone." "How about less criticism and more crime solving?" he proposed. A wry little smile flickered across Lieutenant Watanabe's lips. Then she was back to business. "You see that trailer down there?" She pointed to a white metal rectangle about 200 feet past where the other plainclothes cop was still sipping his coffee. He was also looking at his phone, and from the distance, Peter couldn't be sure, but it looked like he was playing some kind of jewel-matching game. "That's the terminal security office," she said. "The door's on the far side, so if you can meet me there without anyone seeing you, I'd like to show you something. Give me 5 minutes." Then she was gone. Getting to the entrance was no problem. A little creative swinging, and he was through the door. Lieutenant Watanabe was seated at a desk, running her fingers along a keyboard. It was gloomy, but a half a dozen video monitors illuminated her face, each showing a different section of the facility. The trailer smelled of old gym clothes. Watanabe turned the moment he entered, and her hand moved toward her gun, not quite touching it. She might be willing to work with him. She might even trust him on principle. But she wasn't about to let her guard down. Peter didn't like her any less for it. It was common sense. "I told everyone I need to concentrate in here, so we have a few minutes." She began without any preamble. "But we don't have all the time in the world, so save your comments and questions for the end." Her fingers danced across the keyboard. One of the monitors went dark. They began playing a recording. The first thing she showed him was the black and white clip revealing his first encounter with Andy. A time signature spun rapidly in the lower left corner. It was always weird watching footage of himself. There was a part of his mind that never quite got used to seeing himself from the outside. "When I left, he was fine," Spider-Man said. "The footage backed him up." "Quiet," she said, forwarding the footage for what looked like only a few minutes. It showed Andy walking away from the dock, trying to keep to the shadows, probably mindful of the security cameras. Then Spider-Man leapt in behind him, landing lightly on his feet, so lightly that Andy seemed not to notice. Definitely not how things happen. He knew that move, knew how to land from 30 or 40 feet up without making a noise. He did it all the time to get a drop on the bad guys. It had taken him months to learn the trick back when he first started out. Now it was second nature. The problem was, That wasn't him, was it? The moves were right, so much so he had to remind himself that it was impossible. He looked at the time signature. By that point, he was well on his way to the construction site. Holy crap! It has to be the guy! The imposter! He was about to open his mouth to say something when the Spider-Man imposter raised his right hand. He held a gun. It looked absurd and strange and grotesque. Spider-Man never touched a gun, unless it was to get it away from some idiot who had one. Even then, he usually used his webs. Guns were big and loud and nasty. They were difficult to nuance and frequently deadly. They were everything he didn't want to be. The imposter must have said something, because Andy jumped, his shoulders lurching upward, and his legs wobbling in mid-stride. He turned and then started to backpedal. There was the burst of muzzle flash, a violent eruption of light that obscured everything else in the dark frame. When the light cleared, Andy lay on the ground. The imposter took a moment to examine the body. Then he fired 3 more shots into the prone figure. He paused for another instant, and then shifted his gaze to look at the security camera. At least it seemed like he did. It was hard to tell with the mask. He then raised his left hand. A web shot out, and he propelled himself out of the camera's field of view. Spider-Man needed time to gather his thoughts. There were hundreds of things he wanted to say, and he didn't even know yet what half of them might be. Ideas burst into his mind, only to replace by others: outrage, pity, indignation. Raw emotions had the advantage here, but there were other things. Observations of minor details that some distant, calmer part of his mind knew might be of use to the detective. It was hard to stick to logic, though, and he had died facing an impersonator. He died believing that Spider-Man had gunned him down. It didn't make the crime any worse, but it made him all the more determined to do something about it. I didn't do that, he said. I would never do anything like that. It's inconsistent with your past behavior. Watanabe replied in a clinical tone. And it would be hard to prove that one person wearing a mask is the same as another person wearing the same mask. The perp moves a whole like you do, though, and that's harder to mimic. If you have an alibi, it would help us. Maybe there's another person you might be on camera at the same time. Though, again, we still have the mask and identity problem. First of all, that's not me. His thoughts began to shift into focus. At least some of them. I don't use guns, and I absolutely don't go around assassinating people. Even the Daily Bugle, back when Jameson was calling for my head, never claimed I would do that. I believe you, Watanabe said, replaying the footage, but my opinion doesn't count as evidence. Spider-Man leaned in closer to the screen, peering at the costume figure who appeared there. Freeze it, he said. There. The suit isn't quite right. It's close. It's a decent copy. Definitely better than something you get from a costume shop. But the design is a little off. I can't say anything about the color, but the spider icon doesn't look exactly like mine. I noticed that too, Lieutenant Watanabe said. Here, look at the earlier footage. She brought up another screen. You would have had to change your outfit into something nearly identical and then come right back. It doesn't make sense, but whenever we're dealing with costume vigilantes, making sense doesn't always apply. She let her voice trail off in a way that indicated she was playing devil's advocate and not arguing a position she believed. Spider-Man took a deep breath. Organizing his thoughts, he needed to tell her everything about what had happened and had to figure out what would be most useful. She pulled out her cell phone and he began describing his encounter with Andy. Getting the tip about the construction site, he went through everything that had happened there as well. It sounds awfully convenient, she said tonelessly. As she typed, A guy who can copy your moves just happens to show up the same night Spider-Man is filmed killing a kid? She shook her head. Like I said, things with your crowd don't always make sense, but this feels like a setup. The disposable henchmen were there to slow you down while the real bad guy changed his clothes and hightailed it over there to face you. It sounded plausible, but there were still a lot of unanswered questions. Why change his clothes at all? Maybe because he wanted you to see this, she said with a shrug. Probably figured you'd catch it here on the news, rather than here with the cop. But I think the shooter wanted this video to be a gut punch. Someone is calling out to you. I'd ask if you have any enemies, but that's a stupid question. If the construction site has video cameras, and most of them do, then it will at least prove that part of my story. I'm thinking the same thing, she said. You got an address? He told her about the building, and Lieutenant Watanabe's eyes went wide. She set down her phone and turned to look at him. Are you kidding me? You sure that's the location? Yeah, he said. Why? She let out a long breath that hissed between clenched teeth. It's hidden behind hundreds of pages of documents and a half-dozen shell companies. But that construction site is owned by Wilson Fisk. She worked her mouth as if she was trying to get rid of a bad taste. The freaking kingpin of crime.